Knowledge is knowing that Frankenstein wasn't the monster. Wisdom is knowing that Frankenstein was the monster. Hello, Internet! Welcome to Film Theory, where, like the cast of Fame, I'm determined to live forever, and wear delightfully 80s leg warmers while doing it. And so, in my quest for immortality, you can bet my eye was drawn to the new movie Victor Frankenstein, starring the epic duo of Charles Xavier and Harry Potter. No, not that version of Xavier. There you go. Now, when it comes to film adaptations, Frankenstein is about as classic as it gets, with films going back over a century. But many of the things we associate with the tale of Frankenstein actually got their start on celluloid and not cellulose. That's, film and not paper. I use the highfalutin words for the alliterative effect. That's the type of quality writing you can expect here on Film Theory, ladies and gentlemen. For example, the doctor's grave robbing started in the film. Neck bolts, grab your popcorn, it's in the film. Hunchbacked assistant, film. In fact, in the book, he has no assistant. And the name Igor isn't mentioned once, which is a huge loss for Mary Shelley since she totally missed out on Danny Rad's adorable British accent.
Do you realize how significant this is?
Oh, you're so cute, Harry Potter. It's weird to be saying that about a guy who is literally the same age as me. I think. Is he the same age? I don't even know. He's younger than me. Damn. Curse you and your magical youth. Anyway, digressions aside, with zombies all the rage these days and the new movie out now, it got me thinking, why don't we look at pop culture's most famous zombie, Frankenstein's monster, and the science of bringing a human back from the dead? I mean, times have changed since Mary Shelley's book. Is this work of science fiction still more fiction than science? What sort of challenges would the good doctor face if he were to try and do these sorts of experiments in real life? Is it possible to reanimate the dead? The answer, surprisingly, is yes. And it may shock you to know that the Walking Dead are around you right now as we speak. I mean, the real Walking Dead, not the TV show. Carl! Let's start off with harvesting organs from dead bodies. And for that, we turn to the Big D. No. Not quite. Why are you even guessing? There is no chance that you're ever gonna get— No, it's not that. You're never gonna get it. Big D020858, the official code for tissue and organ harvesting as recognized by the National Library of Medicine. Earl, I don't know why you insisted on shoving all these images onto the screen. I told you there was no chance that you would get it. I appreciate the enthusiasm, though. Anyway, the phrase organ harvesting is a medically recognized term with its own official code. Who knew, right? I'm sure a bunch of pre-med students are currently typing in the comment section right now that they knew. Well, good for you guys. On that note, here's a joke for you. How do you know when someone's pre-med? Don't worry, they tell you. Ho ho! Shots fired! Bow, 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 bow. That's me doing an air horn sound effect. Anyway, the process of harvesting working organs from a deceased person and giving them to living people who desperately need them has been around for decades, and today the majority of donated organs actually come from the deceased. In fact, I myself am a registered donor, so better call dibs on my body parts before I go. I can already start to see the fights breaking out in the comments section over who will get my theorist spleen. And not only are transplants from the deceased common, like Dr. Vic, who gathers his parts from multiple quote-unquote donors and puts them all into one body, it is indeed possible to take organs from multiple deceased donors and give them to a single recipient. One such case was recorded as early as 1986, where a 12-year-old girl was given a heart from one donor and then a liver from another. But alright, I know what you're thinking. I'm just talking about internal organs. Frankenstein was an amalgamation of a bunch of limbs, and limbs are a whole different thing. And you're right. Kudos to you for being able to tell the subtle difference between a leg and a kidney. But here's the thing. Yes, they're difficult, and yes, they're rare, but limb transplants do happen. After a failed hand attempt in both 1964 and 1998, the first limb transplant to see long-term success was performed on January 14th, 1999 in Louisville, Kentucky. A man named Matthew Scott had lost his left hand in a firework accident during the 80s and had a new one attached. A few short months after his surgery, he threw the first pitch in a Philadelphia Phillies baseball game with his new hand. Since then, there have been hand and arm transplants almost every year since, and the first double leg transplant was performed in 2011. And depending on when you watch this, literally days ago, the most extensive face transplant was completed successfully. Look at us covering topical news stories. In short, limb transplants are still rare, mostly because they cost an arm and a leg, figuratively and literally. But it's that was so bad. But it's definitely not science fiction. This is a regular procedure with a reliable success rate. So the idea of Frankenstein's monster being stitched together from multiple different human corpses isn't as outlandish as it might seem. But okay, we're talking about stitching limbs onto live bodies. What about what I teased at the beginning of the episode? Bringing someone back from the dead. I mean, in order to perform the classic line, "It's alive! It's alive!" It had to be dead to begin with. Otherwise, it's just kinda redundant. So, is it possible to reanimate the dead? To understand that, we have to understand what actually happens to your body when you die. There are two types of death recognized by modern medicine. Well, three if you count legal death, but it's not like Frankenstein's monster was trying to avoid his back taxes or skip jury duty or anything. So that one doesn't really apply here. Let's just talk about the other two. Brain death and clinical death. Brain death is defined by a complete and irreversible cessation of brain function. If you've ever heard of a patient being in a persistent vegetative state, brain death is actually a couple steps below that on the ladder. Patients in a persistent vegetative state still show some amount of brain activity. Their eyes can sometimes track moving objects, they can often breathe on their own, and even swallow food unassisted. Between a vegetative state and brain death is what's called a coma. Comatose patients generally don't respond to any stimulus at all, and won't be able to swallow on their own. However, despite this lack of response, their brain still does show some activity. Both comatose patients and patients in persistent vegetative states still have some chance of progressing back to awareness and even fully regain consciousness. But a brain-dead patient is past the point of no return. Their brain shows no activity, and as a result, their heart probably won't be able to beat on its own. They are literally being kept alive by machines and medical staff. Very few brain-dead patients are kept alive on life support for more than a few days, since it's so expensive and there's literally no physical way for them to ever recover. Generally, after a patient is declared brain dead, the family says their goodbyes, the plug gets pulled, and clinical death begins. Clinical death is defined as when the heart and lungs stop functioning. Usually, we inhale and oxygen enters our bloodstream and consequently gets supplied to all the cells in our body. At the same time, all our cells expel waste and other nasty stuff, and this gets carried away from us when we exhale. If we no longer supply oxygen and nutrients to the cells, then they won't have the energy to function. And if we no longer exhale, then the cells have no place to put their waste. This means that cells lacking any energy source begin to weaken while rapidly accumulating all sorts of acidic waste that they can't get rid of. Eventually, their membranes wither and they explode, obviously dying in the process. This is called autolysis, and different cells die at different rates. Brain cells tend to be the first to go, needing only 3 minutes before they start showing signs of damage, while things like kidneys and livers can last up to 20 minutes, and muscle cells can literally last for days. This issue becomes a huge point when doctors harvest organs from deceased donors. How long have the donors been clinically dead, and how damaged have those organs become? Because brain cells are so fragile, clinical death is usually followed by brain death. Notice though that I said usually. Unlike brain death, you can come back from clinical death. Remember, clinical death is defined by the cessation of the body's vital functions, like heartbeat and breathing. And while yes, those systems might go down for a while, with prompt enough attention, those systems can be brought back online. And here's the really crazy thing. Believe it or not, doctors during certain procedures will intentionally induce clinical death in their patients, perform the surgery, and then reanimate their patients right there in the hospital room. They are literally inducing death in people, working on them, and then bringing them back to life. They even use electric shocks from defibrillators. It's alive! They don't shout that though. That would be really concerning. I would be very shocked if that was my doctor. Defibrillators, a whole lot easier than harnessing the power of lightning bolts. So let me tell you about this procedure. For certain surgeries, doctors sometimes use what's called deep hypothermic circulatory arrest, where they drain all the blood from a patient's body and replace it with either a saline or potassium solution cooled down to somewhere around 15 degrees Celsius. At this point, the patient's heart stops beating and they stop breathing. They are considered clinically dead. Then the doctor performs the surgery, replaces the blood, and resuscitates the patient. Provided the whole thing lasts less than a half hour, many patients are able to survive this procedure with absolutely no brain damage. This is because when our organs get cooled down by even a few degrees, their metabolic rate slows down, so they use less oxygen and produce less waste, which means they can go much longer before showing signs of damage. Individual organs ready for transplant are kept cold for this very reason. Brain cells can go from lasting only 3 minutes to safely lasting 30. Some have even gone as long as 60. Livers can be bumped up past the 12-hour mark, and kidneys can go to something like 35. Every so often you hear a news story about a skier or a toddler being trapped under ice for something like 40 minutes and somehow they're able to survive and make a full recovery without any damage, despite the fact that they didn't have any oxygen for that entire time. Well, this is why. Despite having your blood drained from your body and you being put to death, it's actually a fairly safe procedure, most famously having been performed on a pregnant woman in 1994 when an aneurysm had ruptured in her left lung. She survived the surgery and successfully delivered a healthy baby a few months later. Let me translate that for you. That child was dead and then brought back to life before he was even born. That's as hardcore as you can get. That's gotta be like some sort of record. Long story short, is all of this a technicality on the definition of death? Admittedly, yes. Though your heart stopping and you no longer breathing seems like a pretty strong ruler to measure your living and dead against. But the biggest moral of the story here is that as long as the brain is still working, the rest can follow. Could Dr. Frankenstein actually bring a patchwork of dead body parts back to life? No, and certainly not during the time period depicted in the film, but medical science today has made it possible for dead limbs to find new bodies and for doctors to reanimate the dead. The only missing link now is finding a way to transplant a living brain into a dead body. Oh, and we still need a nifty use for those neck bolts. But hey, that's just a theory. A film theory. And cut. Like the cast of Fame, I'm determined to live forever and wear delightfully ladies leg warmers. Wow, that's a Freudian slip.